Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. For today's review, patron Aaron Dunn has requested that I cover the 1988 film adaptation of Akira, and I would like to thank him for that, because the original manga is a much bigger work and would have taken a lot longer to get through. But let's not worry about that. The story about the story. As I just mentioned, the story of Akira started as a cyberpunk manga written and drawn by Katsuhiro Otomo during that most cyberpunk of decades, the 1980s. It was a highly praised manga series in Japan thanks to the high-quality artwork, the intricate story, and the fact that it was one of the first cyberpunk anythings to appear in Japan. The popularity of cyberpunk aesthetics in modern Japanese media is all pretty much thanks to Akira. Because of this incredible popularity, and because cyberpunk was also a big fad in the United States, Akira would become one of the first manga to ever be completely translated into English and published in America, and both the colorized edition of the manga and the dubbed film adaptation would fuel the growth of Japanese media in both the United States and France. So to say the least, it's an important work. About midway through the manga's run, Otomo was approached with the idea of making a big-budget anime film adaptation of Akira. This move made a lot of sense at the time. Miyazaki had made some big waves with Nausicaa in 1984 and then Laputa in 1986. Otomo agreed on the condition that he would have creative control over the project, and a committee of companies partnered up in order to foot the $5.5 million budget that the film needed. This beat Laputa's record as the most expensive Japanese animated film of all time, but it would then be beaten by Kiki's Delivery Service in 1989. Now, considering that a feature-length film is far too short to cover 8 years of a weekly manga, even at 2 hours, and that half the manga didn't exist when production began, the movie isn't really a direct adaptation so much as it is a separate story that happens to include the same characters, setting, and themes. Otomo has said that he started by writing an ending for the story and using that to decide which elements from the manga could stay and which ones should go. The film came out in Japan in 1988 and got a box office return of roughly $19 million, a solid profit. Later that year, an American distribution company named Streamline Pictures bought the North American rights, and it's a good thing they did, since the company was started earlier that year and had the stated goal of bringing Japanese anime to the United States with as little editing and alteration as possible. This was not the standard practice at the time, not for anime and not for a lot of other foreign films brought to America. Thanks to Streamline, Akira got a theatrical release in the United States in 1989, but since the market for anime was much smaller at the time, it only got a box office return of $1 million. Still, certainly got the ball rolling. The review. The year is 2019, 30 years after World War III destroyed Tokyo, and the city of Neo-Tokyo is suffering from massive unrest, corruption, government oppression, and gang violence. Kaneda and Tetsuo are two members of a biker gang that get caught up in the attempted escape of a psychic child who is being held by the government. And when Tetsuo is injured by the child, the government discovers that he also has massive psychic potential. The other psychics try to stop Tetsuo since he's using his power destructively, and meanwhile Kaneda works with a resistance member named Kei to try and rescue Tetsuo from the government facility. However, Tetsuo defeats every attempt to stop him, and learns about Akira, another powerful psychic who is cryogenically frozen under the new Olympic Stadium, and was the real cause of the explosion that destroyed Tokyo. Tetsuo travels to the stadium and destroys every army blockade along the way, and this time when Kaneda follows him, it's to try to kill Tetsuo and end his rampage. Tetsuo wins anyway, but then he discovers that Akira has long since been dissected. His powers then rage out of control, Akira comes back despite being dead, and the two of them, and the psychic kids, fall into a new explosion that is apparently supposed to be a new Big Bang for an alternate universe, I guess. The movie ends with the kids giving Kaneda one last warning. Kei is a natural psychic, the first of many, and so they should be careful to make sure that none of this happens ever again. Akira really is one of a kind. The film has some remarkably fluid action scenes, busy and detailed background shots, and very effective uses of color. It also has a few CGI elements that are so well incorporated you can't even tell. It also features a whole lot more blood, violence, and mature themes than you would ever see from an American animated film, especially in the 1980s. That being said, I'm pretty sure that a large percentage of the violence and destruction only exists to give the animation crew a challenge, rather than to reinforce the themes and story of the movie. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, or that action movies don't do the same thing constantly, but I still feel it's worth noting. The soundtrack also stands out thanks to its minimalist nature. Most of the music is nothing more than primal chants and percussion instruments, and when other instruments play, they tend to produce long, droning notes with a kind of ethereal quality to them. Plus, every now and again, the sound cuts out completely, just to make a point. The real weak point of the movie is the story. It's just all over the place. We get introduced to locations we see exactly once before moving on, we see characters interacting with each other once or twice without exploring any details, and we get sudden revelations near the end that don't really matter to the audience because we aren't invested in the characters that those revelations involve. You really do get the sense that this film was severely cut down from a longer work, but I should also say that we do manage to see all of the important plot points, and we spend enough time with Tetsuo and Kaneda to understand their relationship. Also, just about every scene of the film drives home the main themes of Akira, and so while the story is weak, the impression the movie leaves on its audience is still very strong. In the end, Akira is a genre-defining movie that is just as impressive today as it was 30 years ago. After you watch it, you probably won't remember much about the story or the side characters, but you will remember all of the disturbing imagery, destruction, and the incredibly stylistic driving scenes. So be sure to take some time and see it in the highest quality you can get your hands on. The analysis. The heart of Akira is the cycle of violence, and we get to see how the cycle operates in a variety of ways and from a variety of angles. The politicians have become corrupt and lost touch with their constituents, and so instead of addressing the needs of their citizens, they tell the police to crack down on protesters. The police crack down on protesters. The protesters get desperate, and so the protests stop being marches in the streets and start being terrorist attacks and assaults on government buildings. This makes the corrupt politicians nervous, and so they bring in the army and escalate the violence. This escalates the reprisals, and so eventually the military performs a coup d'etat which pleases nobody, and the nation descends into civil war. We also see the cycle of violence play out in the way that the system treats problem children like Kaneda and Tetsuo. Nobody reaches out to these kids. Nobody tries to understand what they're going through, and instead they get beaten into submission and threatened with homelessness and jail time. And so that's what the kids learn. Violence and threats, and naturally they use violence and threats against each other as a way to deal with stress because that's the only thing they've learned how to do. So when a kid like Tetsuo gets some power, a kid who grew up in this environment and gets picked on even by his friends, naturally he's going to abuse that power and go on a rampage against all the people he thinks did him wrong, and anybody else unfortunate enough to get in his way. Because according to how he was taught, that's the way the world works. So it's also no wonder that the psychic kids turned out the way they did, and that one of them went and blew up a whole damn city. The psychics didn't have childhoods. They were taken from their families and tested in laboratories for years, and while they had comfortable rooms and toys to play with, what they didn't have was any sort of nurturing presence. Any parental figures who could help them through their troubles or teach them how to deal with stress. And so when one of them got pushed around once too often, he exploded. Literally. And then he did it again with Tetsuo because the people running the project hadn't learned the goddamn thing in 30 years. And that's another thing the exploding kids represent. Nuclear bombs. This is a Japanese product after all. Japan has more practical experience with the effects of nuclear weapons than any other nation on Earth. The movie makes 2 points in this regard. First, it says that humans aren't ready for the kind of power that these kids, these nuclear bombs, possess. Second, it says that even though we aren't ready, we're gonna have to get ready because it's too late to stop things. The kids from the project leave this reality behind, but there are other psychics appearing in the world, like Kay. And so we have to either learn to treat each other with respect and kindness and raise our kids with love and compassion, or else we will repeat what happened before and very likely destroy ourselves in the process. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.